She'll give me a thumbs up if she can hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, we just need you to say hello or goodbye or something.
Yeah, hello, goodbye, and everything.
Yes.
Okay, Dudu, can you hear us? Oh no, she's just logging in quickly. Okay, it's always important to get the testing, to get that right first. But sometimes we do have a little problem. Now tomorrow, Magnus, we've got our birthday. It's our 8th birthday.
I was just going to say, happy 8th birthday. Can you believe it, Alec?
I can't, hey. It's just like, like a dream in many ways.
Like a blur.
Yeah, I was looking, when we first started, I was looking at my, let's just see if she can see. I was looking at, sorry, Magnus, just speak quickly and let's just see if she can hear.
Yeah, hello. I'm an 8th birthday. I still got your 7th birthday cup.
Of course, from last year.
Yeah, I drink in it. I drink out of it.
Oh, brilliant. You can hear him? You hear him twice. Okay. We're going to have to stop. We're going to have to try something else. It's not working. You know what I'm going to suggest? Can you put your microphone on?
The problem is I'm going to do that. Just 1 second. My microphone.
If you put your mic, if that's on mute.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Just go listen quickly, Dudu, because then we'll see. How's that, Dudu? Do you want to speak quickly, Magnus?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
There's a little delay, I think, for YouTube. Dudu, can you hear Magnus?
Dudu, can you hear me?
It looks better. It's full on. Okay, 100%. Thanks, Dudu. Okay, so we've now overcome all the technical gremlins, and we'll just edit this first little bit. I'm going to hit the sting, and then away we go. Okay, ready. Magnus Heystek has shifted from his usual Wednesday slot with us. Mr. Shapiro is in New York, Magnus. So the reason why we asked you if you could talk to us today rather than your usual on a Wednesday is because he's still getting himself organized. But anyway, thanks for agreeing to shift this time round. But it's a good day to do it because, my goodness, there's a lot to talk about. Starting off with Naspers. You've been amongst those who've been warning us that Naspers is such a huge part of retirement portfolios in South Africa. And lo and behold, the Beijing government this morning started calling Tencent, or its major part of its business, opium for the mind. Now, anyone who knows a little bit about Chinese history will realize that that's a massive insult, given the opium wars between China and Britain and the reason why they occurred and the harm that still exists within China, or distaste about that, because it made a lot of people into opium addicts. So if you've got your central government calling a side of your business opium for the mind, or spiritual opium, as it's also was also described, not surprising to see 10-cent share price take a 10% hit.
It seems like the Chinese government is talking in code to its people and to the markets by throwing in words like opium. I mean, I would imagine that in the South African context, if you use the word apartheid and you use that in a statement about a company or a person, it evokes the same kind of reaction, and it has a very sinister overtone for the tech companies, and especially Nasdaq, because you have to be a very specialist in Chinese communication. What are they trying to say? Because it is a statement and it follows a sequence of attacks on companies in the tech space. I tried to explain to someone last week about that Chinese company in the education space, which had a 100 billion market cap, or $100 billion market cap, the one day and the next day it was worth zero. One can see that, it's not a joke that possibly, as Pete Viljoen asks and Sean Pichet, that Nasdaq or Tencent can be worth zero. And what does that do to trillions of rands in various investments, pension funds, RAs, and Naspers and Prosus. There must be a strategy behind it. The government, the Chinese government, must be playing a game, and they want something out of it. But what it is right now, I really do not know. I would imagine that Koos Becker and his people are trying to decipher this and having chats with the Chinese government. What do you want? What is it what you want to say? And what can we do to alleviate the pressure? But it is having an impact on the JSE with its heavy weighting. And the old saying in investment markets, risk is not a factor until it is a factor. And now in the case of Naspers, it is a factor.
And those VIEs as well. Suddenly there's a focus on the reality that you don't own a share of Tencent, the company. You own a share of the cash flows through a contract, which the Chinese government has said before is an illegal contract, something that comes through the Cayman Islands. So the risk is very, very high, not just to Tencent's operating businesses, but also to shareholders in the company. You've got to wonder what Naspers executives are saying to themselves now. They must be kicking themselves and saying, if only we had unbundled these Tencent shares, in the same way as I suppose many South African investors would be saying, if only we'd sold our Naspers shares when we saw the Chinese government starting to go after capitalists almost a year ago.
If only, Alec, we have done a lot of things in our life, and we had known what markets would do. We were to be extremely rich, comfortable, but we don't. We don't know this, and I think it is not a story that seems to be going away suddenly, because it's not only a South African thing. As I said to you last week, I was watching the many programs on Bloomberg, CNBC, discussing American analysts trying to decipher what the Chinese are doing. And I think Naspers and Bob van Dijk and those people are having very intense discussions with their Chinese counterparts. What exactly does it mean? But the share price is already telling us something. It's down about 30 to 40% from its various peaks, both Prosus and Naspers. And we as a company, although we don't directly deal in direct shares, we have been inundated with our clients asking us what to do with Naspers. And at this point in time, we tell them, we don't know. We simply don't know whether that's good or bad. We're trying to decipher it ourselves, and we're actually trying to have a Zoom meeting with Piet Viljoen, and we're playing the interview that you did with him last week, which is very powerful. We're actually sending it to our clients and say, listen, see what Piet Viljoen has been saying and doing, and even that's not clear cut. So that makes markets, and that keeps us busy, Alec. It keeps us employed.
Yeah, I can tell you our biggest story by some distance this morning is Piet's article that he wrote for us, particularly on the whole Naspers Prosus issue. And there's fair warning there. We move on to other issues, though, and something else which is very much in the news in our community is the whole story of Cape independence. Magnus, where do you stand on this? Because I spoke to another person today, and we're going to be having that interview a little later in the program, Patrick Melly, and he is with the Cape independence movement. There seem to be a whole bunch of them. Just as a little voorsmaakie, he says that the Freedom Front Plus is in favor now, officially, of Cape independence, which is the first political party outside of the Little Cape Party, which never really had any seats, to have stood or put their stake in the ground. What do you think about all this?
Well, Alec, I happen to be down in the Cape at the moment. I'm at Valdevi, where I have my little apartment. And I've been talking to a couple of people on the ground in the gym this morning, and I was chatting to Rag Netling. And the hotel next to Valdevi is normally empty this time of the year. It is chock-a-block of people who have flown down to come and look at property. And it's all around. Wherever you speak, they're just saying, people are selling up in the north, whether it's KwaZulu-Natal, Pretoria, Johannesburg. They are looking at the Western Cape and probably the Southern Cape as an alternative. Whether it politically will be able to separate and become an independent state, I don't think will happen. But I think there might be pressure to give it far more federal powers to run their own affairs independently, perhaps raise some taxes which it can control. Because, again, in the South African context, where can it end up all with the central government losing control over many, many functions of government? So there's a very strong emotional feeling about, yes, we want to be independent. One has to be a bit more careful. We are codependent on each other. But there are guys who give you very strong and cogent arguments that South Africa in 1910 wasn't a coherent country in any way, and that's where our problem started. And that it should have broken up a long time ago with greater elements of federalism, like in Switzerland. That might happen, Alec. At some point, there'll be so much pressure on the ANC or whichever government is still in power that the Cape is just going to say, we're going to break away, even if you don't want to break away. It could be very, very interesting politically as far as that's concerned.
Certainly the feedback from the Cape, and I'm sure you've been hearing a lot of this as well, is that with the looting and the riots that went on in KwaZulu-Natal, there just is no desire whatsoever to be paying for those kind of bills, which this may not be the last time that we see that, given the inability of the Zulu police to stop other Zulu people from doing the kind of things that they did in the month of July.
Yeah, I think the low-level intensity uprising that we've been seeing for a couple of years have just escalated to a new high level. I think it's going to happen again sporadically, because I think disaffected communities have seen this is how you get reaction from government. So I think one can expect more of this happening in highly populated areas close to major cities, because the blueprint has been laid down, has been designed. That's how you almost force government to the table. You disrupt the traffic, the flow of food, the flow of fuel, and the harbors, and a couple of strategic points, airport or two station, and you effectively paralyze a country or a region or a city by doing a couple of things. So this is by no means the last of this uprising. And as we said last time, government has shown itself to be totally incapable with the buses and the trains in the Western Cape, the taxi shootings, the burning of trucks of Moira all these years. And we've seen it in Klerksdorp, Lichtenburg, those areas, when the local communities, as a consequence of infrastructural collapse, cannot speak to people in power. They start uprisings, they start burning stuff, and that gets the reaction from the politicians.
I guess the issue here, and it goes back to a book that I read some years ago by Moises Naim, The End of Power, it was called, where he then forecast. He used to be the Venezuelan Minister of Industry. He then went over and works in the think tank in Washington. And he forecast back then that through technology, we are going to get smaller and smaller within our areas of competence, and that states are going to have to become smaller, because it's impossible to manage such huge tracts of land or geographically dispersed areas as South Africa is. And you wonder if in 1910 you had said to the people there that in 100 years' time you will still be together, and there would be a very different scenario if they would then have voted as they did for the Union of South Africa, if they might not have asked for a very different get-together, a federation perhaps like in Canada, rather than the union that we saw in South Africa, I suppose in a way imposed on the people at the time by the British colonialists.
Well, if you go back in history, and we're going back very far back in the history books and to my high school years, if you read about the internal politics in South Africa around 1910 and even in 1948, I mean, the internal fights within the, let's call it the Afrikaans political parties, was how much control, centralized control or not, or should the provinces have more federal powers? And you had Jannie Smuts versus the Hofmeyrs. And even in those years, we have these debates about to what extent should the power come from the center, like from Pretoria. And as you said, it's a very, very large country. And I know that the off-mayor was in favor of greater federal powers for the various provinces, and in the end it cost him his job and he was booted. So it's a new debate in a new shape, but much more urgent than 50 or 60 years ago.
Another story that is occupying our minds in this evening's program is the rise of Capitec. Interesting to see, and we'll be talking with Gerrie Fourie, the chief executive, about this in a moment, that they're now driving into the loyalty area, where they announced yesterday that if you go into Dis-Chem or I think it's called Baby City, and you give a Capitec card, you automatically, without signing up for anything, you automatically get a 2% cash back. They got a similar thing going with Shell as well. So real simple, Capitec's approach. But that is an organization that seems to have found a solution where others have been struggling in many areas.
Well, large traditional banks still have the overhang of large and physical networks, lots of investment in buildings and branches and people behind the tellers. And here you have a relatively new bank. I think it's 20 years old now, around about 20 years old, when it listed at 50 cents, 2002. You know, slap your face, if only we knew. Come with a new model. It's like you have a fleet of 1,000. And here comes Uber with a totally model, an app on a cell phone that people could not even dream of that you could use in the same type of business. And that's what rejuvenates business all the time. You get very smart people, and they bring technologies from an entirely, totally different space. And there you go. They change the rules of the game. And Capitec has done it, and there's so many other examples that we've seen around the world, in Israel, Switzerland, and particularly in the United States. You must know that if you start a business or you have a dominant market position in the United States, there are 10 other guys trying to break down your business model and come with a newer and a better and a more efficient model. That is the history of capitalism, and we now see it with Capitec doing that to the local or the traditional banks.
Competition works, and it works for all. That Magnus Heystek will be back again next week on Wednesday, though.
Cheers, Alec.